All right. Good morning, Admin Mastermind and Teach Better Family. We just got finished with a wonderful conversation as we were diving into an article from Jennifer Gonzalez, Cult of Pedagogy. And Chad, it was great to have you a part of that conversation and to see all the wonderful administrators all over the country and in Canada.
Yeah, it was a great mastermind today. A lot of really great conversations.
Yeah, so I stumbled upon this article from Jennifer Gonzalez, and I'm going to put the link up here for those who are watching on YouTube. That way you get an opportunity to read the text and kind of understand the metaphor. But I'm going to do my very best, Chad, to kind of go through this.
I'm sure you'll do
share.
fantastic. Yeah.
Well, it's springtime, and this kind of got me thinking about just school culture in general. And I think as school leaders, we've all seen this, we've all experienced it in regards to just seeing different pockets of positivity. And the idea with the marigold is that the marigold is a protective plant. So it gets away pests and harmful weeds. And, you know, a lot of people plant marigolds to protect another plant that they're trying to, you know, have thrive. And so the article is specifically about new teachers and using this metaphor to let leaders and other people know that, like, we need to protect and encourage and create these strong and healthy environments for our new teachers. But I'm thinking, though, it's not just to new teachers. We need to do this with veterans too, because the second piece of the metaphor is the walnut trees, which, you know, are harmful and can be poisonous. And, you know, they were saying, like, we need to make sure that we don't have a culture of walnut trees. We need to make sure that we're kind of doing the opposite and creating this protective space for those to grow. And so I love this guardian metaphor. With that, Chad, you know, we started the conversation about just supporting, nurturing, and growing our teachers and making sure that we have more marigolds in the school. So I was curious, what were some takeaways from the start of our conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with any plants, using the metaphor, you know, all life, but especially plants, are very opportunistic. So the plants that are allowed to thrive will. And I think that showed through in a lot of our conversations, where if you support and encourage those positive people, those marigolds, so to speak, you're going to get more of them. If you build a culture that supports that, you're going to get more of them. But if you allow those walnut trees to take root, to expand, to grow taller, to take more resources, that's what you're going to get, you know, as a leader. And I think we talked through in the mastermind a lot of ways to cultivate those marigolds, to reduce the opportunity that those walnut trees have, and support those marigolds and that positivity in the culture of a building. And so a lot of the conversation, in my opinion, can be summed up in a general 1,000-foot view of, you know, people and adults, just like these plants we're talking about, are very opportunistic. And the environment or garden and soil that you create is going to determine, you know, which ones grow best.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting how folks were just kind of doing a assessment in real time in regards to.
Yeah, you could see them going through their building and their teachers in their classrooms.
They're talking about their teams and, okay, this is more set up with marigolds in this grade level, or this grade level is more of the walnut trees. And then also just making plans of potentially mixing that up for the future and kind of spreading out those who may have kind of a negative spin on things, to make sure that, you know, there are more marigolds within the group to kind of weed out the negativity.
And that was something I think that shone through the entire conversation. I think there were different levels of kind of gardening and weeding that people were talking about. So like at the top level, in terms of building culture and positivity, we talked about like companion planting. Who do you put with other people? Do you want all your walnut trees together? Do you want all your marigolds together? Do you want to like put all your negative Nancy's on one grade level team and all your positives? Or do you want to create more heterogeneous groups so that it doesn't spread and fester in one place? So we talked through kind of different ways to do that. So there's actual, like, where are those people and how are we spacing them out from like a legitimate geographical way to improve the culture so it's not all centered in one location? Or do you go, that corner of my garden's not going to do well, and I'm just going to leave it so the rest can thrive. Like, that's the other approach that we, talked about in terms of like kind of shuffling and moving these types of positivity and negative around your building. So like, I think the transition started there. Like, what do we do with these people who are already where they are? But then it kind of evolved into, what can we do as leaders to cultivate more marigolds, to change walnut trees into marigolds, to create more positive in general. And I think that's where we got into the nuts and bolts of like strategically thinking about how you do things. I mean, how do you organize your meetings and expectations for staff? How do you set the culture during structured time so that trickles into unstructured time? How do you have positive conversations? How do you cut the roots off of a walnut tree earlier rather than later? So how do you address those difficult conversations and things like that? And like, I thought it was really cool how the conversation evolved from this, here are the plants we have, here are the people that we have and how they are in like a very static way. Like, these are how these people are. And then I think it evolved into, but we still can control the evolution of those people into more positivity, into more productive participants in our school, our organization, our culture, to do what's best for kids. So I think that was really neat. And then we even talked about, how to address these things and the SEL components and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of different ways we can take this conversation, but I liked the multiple levels that this conversation took. And I think it's something that all administrators can take into account.
For sure. So I want to touch on something that you discussed, because we did talk about strategies that can be implemented by leaders as far as fostering a culture where there's more positive influence. And one of the things that you had talked about was, since we're talking about analogies, we'll keep with this, was instead of, just looking at the fire, maybe, instead of looking at it and then discussing the fire for 45 minutes, that maybe we should be more task oriented or solution oriented, and maybe, put out the fire. And so if you wouldn't mind just sharing kind of your thought process through that.
Absolutely. If you ask any administrator in any school, in any place in this entire country, which we get to talk to a lot of them, you and me. So they will say that they don't usually like free teacher time or meetings when they get to collaborate, because often they go, you know what, like a lot of them just end up, discussing why Jimmy was late to class for 45 minutes with no solution, and then the meeting's over. I'm not saying nothing ever happens or there's no productivity in those processes, but if you let them just kind of exist on their own, a lot of my experience has been they start talking about how those 3 kids keep misbehaving, or what are we going to do about so-and-so, or all these complaints, right? So when I was like a department head and the science department chair for a school district, one of the structures I put into place was, if a house is on fire, we can walk up to the fire and go, I can't believe they left the toaster on. I know it was Susan's fault because she's always curling her hair and forgetting to unplug her curling iron. Or like, we can sit here and watch the fire burn the house down and talk about why it started, how mad we are about why it started, or we can put out the freaking fire. Okay. and this was always like a rule I had with like, listen, I know there's things we should talk about for why this happened or why these things are happening, but let's put out the fire first, and then we'll assess why they happen so we can move forward. So that's like a first bare level step that you can put into place in any of your meetings. Listen, as a staff, as a team, as a grade level, as a department, as a building, as a district, we put out fires first. We solve the problem and move instruction or the situation forward before we sit here and stew into the why did it happen? I'm really angry. I can't believe I lost my planning period today. Like, yep, all that stuff is awful and I hope it doesn't happen again. But let's solve the problem first. If everyone gets on board with just that idea, you will overcome problems much faster than if everyone just sits and stews and complains about it. And then the other part of that, there's like a second part of it that I always bring up, which is we cannot bring up a problem if we don't have a suggested solution. We have to be solution oriented. Otherwise, we're just creating space for venting, which can be necessary sometimes, but that's not how we want to utilize the limited amount of time we have as a team, a department, as a school, or as a district. I don't want a whole meeting to be taken over about here's the 50 problems. Well, at least we know about the problems with no solutions now. Versus going, here are 3 solutions we can implement to improve our situation every time we meet. That's going to be a very different outcome. So those things can help create more of a positive atmosphere because you're always solving problems. You're always overcoming obstacles versus sitting and stewing and planting walnut trees, to go back to our metaphor.
Yeah. No, I love it. So just in addition to that, some additional strategies to implement, people talked about recognition, making sure that we are not only identifying strengths, but highlighting folks' strengths. Then we talked about choices, allowing teachers to have choices, or even being a part of the decision-making process. Because as we know, a lot of times the decision's already made, and then we ask for feedback, even though that feedback and potential opinions on where the decision needs to be made doesn't really get factored in because it's already the leaders have already made the decision. So allowing them to have the autonomy to be a part of that. Someone had made a great analogy in regards to making a decision over cake or death and being surprised when everyone chooses cake.
Which was I love that analogy. Yeah.
So the idea is being that sometimes teachers may not choose the option you would as a leader, but sometimes that's okay, right? Because, as a whole, a collective whole, if that's what needs to occur, then we need to allow that power and that autonomy and allow the teachers to be a part of that decision-making process. Real quick, though. Oh, go ahead, Chad.
I was going to say, just like learners, when you foster ownership, you empower people to do great things. If people don't feel like they're part of the process or they're being celebrated for the work they're doing, they won't buy in and they won't take ownership of it, which means you're going to be stuck forcing them to do things all the time versus them buying into a process.
Mm-hmm. No, so true. All right. I wanted to touch on that SEL component that you had mentioned earlier to kind of close down our conversation. But for those who, want to read this article in regards to marigolds and walnut trees, link is up on the screen here. But I wanted to touch on just the walnut tree itself, right? Because it's sometimes hard to navigate interactions with someone who's extremely negative. And I thought we probably spent a good 15 minutes just on this question alone, which was just how to minimize the toxic influence. And there was all these different examples of really tough conversations, questions to ask to kind of get to the root of the problem. Because, we all know, like, people aren't coming in and saying, like, I want to be a horrible teacher today. I want to be a horrible administrator.
Correct.
I want to be a toxic, poisonous person and destroy the culture of the school. No one's saying that when they're waking up. But will you just touch on, like, just the SEL strategies and why it's so important not to just implement that with our students, but then also, use these same things with our adults?
Yeah, I think this is an area where I think we don't think adults need any SEL considerations because we're paying them to be there. Yep. Like, there's like this really cold-hearted way to look at like education as a job and dissociate the emotional side of it. When you have teachers and educators literally giving everything they have and getting very little back sometimes. And that's emotionally draining. I've been there myself before, and it gets really hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, depending on how deep in that hole you are. And so when you approach these conversations, there are 2 things I always recommend. And our team approaches these conversations with teachers when we're coaching and supporting them as well, where you always assume best intentions first. Always assume that they're doing the best they can with what they have and what they think is best for kids, even if it disagrees with what you think is best for kids. Assume that they are coming from that perspective. Whether they are or not is a different story. but assume that they are. And that will make the conversation go better, because if you approach it and go, I think this is why I think you're doing this. And then like the second part of that equation, though, if I'm assuming best intentions, I'm going to ask questions first. Mm-hmm. Ted Lasso has one of my favorite quotes. He says, be curious, not judgmental. And I think I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he said, be curious, not judgmental. So if I walk in and go, you're a bad teacher, you don't like kids, you should have a different job, I'm being judgmental before the conversation starts. But if I start curious, I can then go, hey, I noticed you did X, Y, Z, or I've noticed that you've been pretty negative in our conversations recently. I feel using I feel language, because that's super helpful, because no one can tell you how you feel instead of pointing the finger. I feel like this is saying these things, or this means this. Can you correct that if I'm mistaken? Give the person the opportunity to either defend, explain, or kind of control the conversation. People will be much more open in a conversation they feel they have some control in, versus one where they feel that you're just coming in on the attack. Because as soon as people shut down on the defensive, that conversation's not going anywhere. Their fight or flight's going to kick in, and no listening is going to occur. And this is all all the stuff that you live in, right? This trauma-informed response, right? Yeah. That's all that's happening, is you're going to shut that adult down. They're going to go, everything's fine. Sorry, I won't do it again, because I want this conversation to be over, because my brain thinks a bear is chasing me, because my sympathetic nervous system is going insane right now, and I just want to get away. Versus, oh, I need to correct this because I'm having an open dialogue with someone. I'm going to keep it calm so that those things can get uncovered and we can have a meaningful conversation to move the needle. And I think that's super useful for kiddos, but it still works with adults, because it's the same scenario.
Yeah, humans are humans. It doesn't matter the age, and we have to understand that they're going through potentially chronic stress. They're going through trauma. There's triggers. I mean, the things that we talk about, as far as setting up a supportive environment for our kids, we got to do for our adults also. And I mean, just some of the examples that our administrators were providing, that asking these tough, crucial conversations, of what's going on behind the scenes, and really getting to the root of the problem, and then things are uncovered, like, I'm going through a divorce, or I've lost custody of my kids. I
just had a really bad doctor's visit and found out something I didn't want to hear.
I've got cancer, right? And
right.
I've all of those things that I just mentioned. I've had staff members come into my office, and we've had these really difficult conversations of uncovering what's going on in the world. And we do have to understand that they have lives outside of the school building, that they may be going through some just horrific things, that we need to be more about the support versus the expectations, right? Because sometimes they need that grace, and to get some additional resources or time or whatnot, to be able to work through whatever is going on in the background, to be the best version of themselves on the campus with our students.
Yeah. And I think clarity in what you expect also comes into play. Even if in that difficult conversation, you just ending that conversation and going, so I want this to get better. Cool. Awesome. That's non-specific. There's no outcome that's defined. But if I leave that conversation and go, hey, I'm not saying you have to fix this all tomorrow. Okay. However, this week, could we try these 2 things? You know what I mean? Could we try these 5 things, these 1 thing? Or for this week, let's just focus on this part. Can we focus on that? Awesome. And then meet again and go, you did an amazing job. How about we work, like, move the needle versus going, let's lift the whole load at the same time, because they're going to mentally shut down if you go, there's a famous scene. It's not really a famous scene, but it's a cartoon, because I have a lot of kids. There's a movie called How to Train Your Dragon. It's a DreamWorks film, I believe. And there's a point where there's a son got a father who's disappointed in him. And he goes, could you just fix this? And the son goes, you just gestured to all of me. And I feel like we do that with adults sometimes, where we just gesture and go, could you just not be this way? Thanks. And we just gesture to all of them, when that's the least helpful thing we can do. If you don't have specific expectations that you're going to support them moving on, you can't expect them to improve, because they're going to revert every single time if you don't give them achievable goals.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point to end our conversation. Chad, I know me and you could probably talk for another hour because this was such a
we'll
rich
have our own
conversation.
12-hour live.
That's all right. This is important stuff. And I think this is, you know, talking about school culture and finding just these, you know, walnut trees, if you will, or weeds. I don't know what metaphor you want to use.
It's the work behind the work, right?
Right.
Like
it's the things that, you know, as far as leaders, we don't get practice at university on this, right? It's trial by fire. And, you know, that was brought up too, of just like, I didn't know I was going to have such crucial and really emotional conversations with my staff. And it's something that needs to be addressed. It needs to be highlighted. It also needs to be something that we work on every single day, because we are working with human beings, and it's a human profession. And so I think it's so important. I want to thank Jennifer Gonzalez, obviously, for those who are listening on a podcast application. It's cultofpedagogy.com/marigolds. That's the article that we use today. Very important resource. I would love for those who are listening or watching on YouTube to make sure that you at least take a look at that. Obviously, too, I've been throwing up on the screen that, you know, this mastermind group meets every Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast player and you want to join, head over to teachbetter.com/mastermind. It is free. And I assure you, though, that even though it's free, you're getting quite a bit of value from this group. Also, we've got a wonderful Facebook group that's growing like crazy. So that's Teach Better Admin Mastermind. So make sure that you're going over there and joining. I think, Chad, we're almost to like 250 administrators and leaders in that group. So we haven't been in existence for very long, but we're growing like crazy. So if you're listening or watching, make sure you're heading over to Facebook. And yeah, man, Chad, I appreciate you. I appreciate the group, the conversation. Like I said, it was extremely rich and very valuable.
Always a pleasure, my friend.